titled Shaping the Digital World Order, Norms and Agency Along the Digital Silk Road in Southeast Asia, or NORM for short, which is sadly coming to an end, and this event today is part of our final conference. First, a few housekeeping items. The event is being live streamed, and the recording will also be published online afterwards, so feel free to share the link with interested colleagues who were not able to attend. We have breakfast at the back, as well as a range of publications that stem from this project, so please do grab copies of those, and also more outputs are on their way, so keep an eye on our website. There is also a photo exhibition in the room, which I encourage you to explore. It's made with pictures taken in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which aim to translate the project's research outputs into imagery across 6 thematic boards, guiding visitors from micro-level context to local communities in Southeast Asia. Now on to the event proper. I will first introduce the speakers who will join me in the discussion afterwards, then say a few words about the projects and share some reflections after 3 years of research. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So the project has engaged a team of 12 researchers based in 6 different countries. But they couldn't all be here today, so I am joined in person by Dr. Chen Chui Kwik, who is Professor of International Relations at the National University of Malaysia, as well as non-resident senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University Foreign Policy Institute and a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, China. His research focuses, among other topics, I should say, on smaller state foreign and defense policies, especially Malaysia's, Asian security, primarily hedging in international relations, and the geopolitics of connectivity cooperation, and he has written extensively on these issues. Then to the very far right is Habib Abianskoan, who is a researcher at the Department of International Relations at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. He holds an MA in International Economics and International Relations from Johns Hopkins University. And his research interests include critical minerals and emerging technologies, geoeconomics, non-traditional security, and Indonesia's foreign policy. Then to his left, Julio Amador, who is the executive director of the Philippine American Educational Foundation, the interim president of the Foundation for the National Interest, and founder and trustee of the non-profit FACS Asia. He also previously worked in the office of the President of the Philippines and served as the Director General of the Foreign Service Institute. So he's got a policy-making past. Or perhaps is it still at present? I'm not sure. His research, when he wears his academic hat, his research covers ASEAN issues, Southeast Asian security and international relations, and Philippines' foreign and defense policy. And then last but not least, sitting in the middle, my colleague Nick Marsh, who will moderate the discussion, is a senior researcher here at PRIO, working on issues related to arms trade and security, including arms trafficking and transfer controls, and has been working on the NORM project looking at export and controls of technology. So the NORM project explores the political and social consequences of China's digital Silk Road, henceforth DSR, which is a collection of investments in digital technologies including AI, cloud computing, e-commerce, surveillance cameras, 5G networks, smart city programs, and more, in developing countries. We have had a focus on, again, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and the broader Southeast Asian region. So as China seeks to become a global technological superpower, its digital investments may reshape international norms, digital governance, and geopolitical alignments in the 21st century. So we set out at the beginning of the project to understand both China's intentions and policies, but also, and most importantly perhaps, how stakeholders from government, business, and civil society in the 3 countries engage with DSR projects. Often in the media and in politics, there tends to be a narrative that China is imposing its authoritarian model of data governance onto developing countries who are merely accepting it without any contestation. While there is some niche academic work that teases out the nuances of these relationships, which are far from being one-sided, these nuances often get lost. There are many findings and reflections from this project, but given the limited time that we have today, I wanted to highlight 3 main issues, and hopefully we can touch on more as we discuss this later. So the first is with reference to the current trade war. Southeast Asia offers a unique lens through which to examine the global influence of the DSR, but also the larger China-US technological competition. the region holds immense strategic value for Beijing, both economically and geopolitically, as it seeks to foster a China-led regional integration. ASEAN still maintains its position as China's largest trading partner, and Chinese tech giants like Huawei, Alibaba, and Ant Financial have made the region a key testing ground for China's export of digital norms and technologies. Southeast Asian economies, at the same time, particularly our three countries, have been hit hard by US tariffs and are heavily dependent on exports to the US, and therefore face severe challenges in a scenario of complete decoupling between the two superpowers. The second issue is about geopolitics and diplomacy. So in his first overseas trip this year in April, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia in an effort to promote, again, China's vision for the region, emphasizing unity against external confrontation. At the same time, this is also the same time that this is a region that is extremely strategic for China, there is also deep uncertainty about US policy engagement and foreign policy towards Asia, and more specifically Southeast Asia. Then the region is also being courted by US allies, such as Japan. So earlier this year, Prime Minister Ishiba visited Malaysia and Indonesia, where he tried to strengthen Japan's ties with these countries. And again, in April, he also visited Vietnam and the Philippines with the aim to bolster security and economic partnerships in response to China's growing assertiveness in the region. The Trump administration's confrontational posture towards China further escalates both of these two first dynamics, pushing countries in the region to navigate a complex strategic landscape. Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which we chose at the beginning for their mix of substantial DSR funding, political diversity, and institutional openness, illustrate how developing democracies respond to rising Chinese influence while balancing competing global pressures. As such, we believe the region not only reflects current global fault lines, but also offers broader insights into how digital governance and technology investments are contested, localized, and hybridized in a multipolar world. Third and last issue that I wanted to bring up today is which model of data governance has the potential to become the most influential in the future. And ultimately, I think it's arguably even a question of whether democracy, at least in digital spaces, can survive or not. So there are, broadly speaking, three main regulatory and normative models that have emerged. First, China is attempting to create norms for data governance that conform to its conception of the future digital world, for instance, by launching a global initiative on data security. And this is a state-centric, top-down authoritarian model which strictly controls the internet and the information space. Then there is the EU model, so to speak, which views itself as a kind of a super regulator with global interests, and it's mostly concerned with data privacy and citizens' rights. And then there is a third model, which is the US model, which takes a more private sector-driven and decentralized approach to regulating technology than the EU, with some caveats, of course, because at least in the previous administration had been intervening more heavily on regulating critical technologies, at least. So if China manages to, quote unquote, win the internet, a group of influential scholars and tech industry practitioners argued a few years back, then we would end up with a digital world in which the governing standards and norms do not reflect democratic values. In our project, we have seen how third countries, particularly Southeast Asian nations, actually exercise quite a lot of agency with respect to the choice between one model or the other, leading to creative hybrid solutions that reflect domestic political agendas, institutional realities, and economic needs, among other factors. So drawing from a body of over 90 expert interviews with members of government, civil society, academia, and business in the three countries, as well as the analysis of over 200 official documents, our research highlights that while Chinese investments are welcomed in the region for their potential to enhance connectivity and infrastructure, they also raise significant concerns about data security, digital sovereignty, and normative alignment. Across Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, domestic actors, including, again, government, civil society, academia, and business, demonstrate varying degrees of agency and negotiation power in responding to Chinese influence. In Indonesia, for instance, the discourse reveals a clear tension between embracing technological development and resisting normative alignment with China's authoritarian data governance model. The Philippines case underscores how DSR projects intersect with broader geopolitical dynamics, including the US-China rivalry, and amplifies debate over surveillance and national security. Malaysian stakeholders, meanwhile, are shown to pragmatically engage with DSR initiatives, weighing economic opportunity against strategic vulnerability. So collectively, these cases illustrate that the DSR is not a monolithic force, but a contested process shaped by local priorities, international alignments, and the evolving geopolitical landscape. This underscores the importance of moving beyond binary narratives of influence to appreciate the complex interplay of norms, interests, and agency in the digital domain. But I will let our experts go into more details of the three countries, and so I will join them on the stage and give the word to Nick.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. And I hope for the rest of the session we can have an interesting discussion. And so I'd like to start off and invite Cheng Chui, Habib, and Julio to expand a bit more on some of the issues that Ilaria gave us in her introduction. And first, to the three of you, I've got a general question, and then I'll follow up with some more detailed ones. But first, if we start off with how would you see geopolitical rivalry being played out in the technology sector in Southeast Asia? I could start off with Cheng Chui and then move over. Yes.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Ilaria. Good morning to everyone, and also a good day for those of you who are joining us online. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, particularly Ilaria, Nick, and also all colleagues in the team for having us here. A pleasure to join you all today, and along with my good and old friends from Southeast Asia, Habib, and also Julio. So let me do my job now by responding to Nick's excellent first question. And I thought that is a seemingly short but complex question. It's complex because of it clearly entails and involves a number of dimensions. Let me just highlight three dimensions with my 3 points. And the first point is clearly geopolitical rivalry in technological sector is an extension. It's an extension of a more fundamental big power rivalry, in this case, particularly US-China rivalry in strategic, in political sectors as a whole. So it's an extension of something more fundamental. And to relate this point with what Ilaria said so well at the very beginning, I thought Ilaria's raised a lot of important points, but one of the key points is that Southeast Asia and the reasons why PRIO and the team focus on Southeast Asia, this because of Southeast Asia clearly in the context of US-China rivalry, we are frontliner. We are among the frontliner states. And we'll add that we are frontline middle states. Frontline middle states in the sense that these are a group of states, sovereign actors, who are sandwiched between two or more competing powers and giants. So in that case, we are bringing a Southeast Asian perspective in our very unique Southeast Asian accents, but clearly the middle state or frontline middle state is something that I guess we can relate to all of you from your region. And I would think that middle states means those who find ourselves sandwiched between the two, and we know that both competing powers want something from you. Either they want some benefits, they want you to do something, they don't want you to do something. And middle states' dilemma is that you know whatever you do, whether you do whatever you say, how you position, has impacts on your own goodwill, on your people's goodwill. Trump 2.0's tariff is just a reinforcing theme along this line. So technology is one of the many domains and all that, which brings me to my second point. Second point, US-China or geopolitical rivalry on the tech domains is very much a multi-sector, multi-actor processes. And this will go on. It will not stop in 2025. It will not stop at the end of this project. I think it's just a starting. We are going to see that. It's multi-actor in the sense that it's not just US and China. Europe, EU, and Northeast Asian powers, South Korea, and also Japan, and all that, they are clearly a part of the players. You can say that they are next tier players, next to US, China as the top tier, but it's multi-actor also in the sense that it is not just state actors. Non-state actors, big firms, technological firms and all that from across the spectrum matters as well. And it's multi-sector in the sense that, tech sector, it's a multi-sector domains in the sense that you have a 5G, you have also a data center, you have a semiconductor, the list can go on and on and on. So all these have, I would say, carries a different dynamics across a multi-sector and also a multi-actor. And the third and also my final point very quickly is that despite this intensifying geopolitical rivalry, despite the mounting pressures in almost all sense and all sectors, semiconductor chip war is just one aspect. And many of us who are in the industry, Malaysia, Vietnam, for example, we are clearly sense a lot of pressure. But the third point here is that despite this growing rivalry and also tension and pressures, I still cautiously believe that small states, host countries, middle states, frontline or less frontline, still have some agency. Still have some agency in the sense that I don't think we are going to say yes completely or say no completely to any of the competing powers. For survival, I would say, let me highlight this, for survival. Not so much for values, not so much for ideology, so on and so forth. For survival, a reason domestically and also internationally, our instinct as small states, post-colonial states even, is that we are not interested in take sides with anyone in any technological sector or non-technological sector. That would be the last thing we are going to do. And small state agency, host country agency means that we know things are getting tougher, space are shrinking, but we will try our very best to still maneuver in one way or another. So much so that it would bring some benefits to what we need domestically and mitigate. We cannot eliminate whatever risks are out there. It's beyond our control. Nobody can do that, and there is no magic in that sense. So, but small state agency driven by survival, I believe is an important point to highlight for this, the purpose of this workshop. And with that, I hope I set the stage for my two friends who are going to share more insightful points. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Cheng Chui. And thanks for that eloquent advocacy for being non-aligned. There's obviously a long history of non-alignment in Southeast Asia. So Julio, I can pass over to you.
Thank you, Nick. And of course, let me join Cheng Chui in thanking Ilaria and Priyo for bringing us here. This is my first time in Norway, and it's been a very good experience so far. So Cheng Chui said we are old and good friends. I'm wondering if I'm the old and you're the good friend.
So it's a sensitivity.
But to answer Nick's question, let me just look at the perspective, from of the United States primarily when we talk about the West, where technological choices are often framed within a binary geopolitical paradigm. This discourse tends to construct an us versus them narrative wherein Southeast Asian states are implicitly or explicitly pressured to align with Western technological ecosystems, frequently to the exclusion of engagement with actors that do not adhere to Western liberal democratic norms, most notably China. Conversely, China's strategic communication towards Southeast Asia adopts a markedly different tone. As the region's most economically integrated and geographically proximate major power or great power, China tends to use development-centric narratives that resonate with the immediate priorities of ASEAN member states. Although divergent from Western and perhaps Japanese diplomatic approaches, China's engagement emphasizes cooperative mechanisms that ostensibly support the region's aspirations for technological and economic competitiveness. Thus, from this perspective, from the PRC's perspective, it mutually benefits with ASEAN by viewing the bloc as a market for its homegrown technologies. Situated between these two competing narratives is ASEAN and, of course, Southeast Asian states, which we have to, to look at differently, because ASEAN member states' foreign policies and economic priorities are not always mediated through ASEAN. ASEAN, at the end of the day, is an intergovernmental body which does not foster, in my view, regional interests. National interest within Southeast Asia takes prime priority for foreign policy and even economic policy. Despite the institutional complexity of ASEAN, it remains the primary mechanism through which Southeast Asian states, however, manage our external engagement. And if you have to look at Southeast Asia, please look at it from this perspective. It has more than 600 million citizens and peoples, very diverse governmental institutions, one of the biggest markets, emerging markets in the world, projected to have some of the biggest economies the next 20, 30 years. Biggest maritime and land areas if you compare it to other regions. So this is what makes Southeast Asia very complex when you talk about technological competition between US and China and the rest of the world. So I'll turn it over to Cheng Chui's old friend.
Yes.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Julio, for the handover. And let me begin my speech by also joining other panelists to say thank you to Ilaria, Nick, and also colleagues at PRIO for the past 3 years of very good research cooperation between PRIO and also CSIS Indonesia. And thank you for also flying us here, like to Norway. This is a very good opportunity to better understand Scandinavian country and also how Scandinavian countries look at the world. With regards to the question posed by Nick about how Southeast Asia or how this geopolitical competition on technology takes place, I think I would like to begin by saying that I look this geopolitical technology competition as a supply chain form, like at the downstream, midstream, and also the upstream. At the upstream, when we talk about the upstream competition between US and China, we see more and more talk about critical minerals, right? Either rare earth or either nickel or other critical minerals like, copper, among others, that creates or that serve as an input for green and also emerging technologies. So at the upstream, you have a competition regarding the critical minerals. And then now at the midstream level, you have a competition of a semiconductor. You talk about the restriction from the US or restriction from China, but definitely they compete over midstream or, intermediate goods with regards to the final products of this technology. And then the last one is at the downstream level, right? The use of the technological product, either AI, either 5G, either satellite, among others, and so on and so forth. So these, spectrum of the technological competition from the downstream up to the from the upstream up to the downstream. So now we talk about Southeast Asian countries, especially Indonesia. I think Malaysia and also the Philippines have been well presented. But with regards to Indonesia, Indonesia doesn't have very much capital in engaging this kind of geopolitical technology competition somehow. But yes, we have a uniqueness in the way we see the great power competition. I think Indonesia appreciates healthy great power competition because great power competition enables choices. I think Dr. Quick and also Julio already mentioned about choices. And I think as long as the great power competition remain healthy and anchored in certain guardrails, then everyone can reap the benefit of this kind of competition. But when the competition starts into, turning into decoupling or unhealthy rivalry, then no one will get anything out of this competition, basically. So there are 3 points or 3 frames in the way Indonesia sees China, right? So the first one, Indonesia sees China as a source of investment. I think 30% of Indonesia's annual FDI comes from China, especially with regards to the capital-intensive sectors like mineral processing. So we talk about the competition at the upstream level, about the critical minerals. And then the second point is Indonesia also sees China as an export destination, as a main export destination. So Indonesia's export products mainly consist of commodities. 3 of them are nickel, palm oil, and also coal. And three of them, I think a large chunk of these export go to China, especially with regards to nickel. 80 to 90% of Indonesia's nickel export goes to China. So you can imagine China can manufacture it into like steel products or other technological products, basically. And then the third point is Indonesia sees China as a provider of affordable technology. You know very well Indonesia is a middle income country. Not all population can afford high quality technologies. They can just afford affordable or cheap technologies, and that being provided by China, either in terms of digital infrastructure, smartphone, among others, and so on and so forth. So this is the way Indonesia sees China. And there are four ways Indonesia sees the United States, but also in the frame of competition. One is definitely about Indonesia sees the US as a security provider or balancer, right? For many maritime as a member states, China is kind of threatening with regards to the territorial dispute in the South China Sea or like economic dominance and so on and so forth. But the US presence, gives a bit balancer in the equation. So that's the first one. And the second one, Indonesia's ICT export. This is very interesting. Indonesia ICT export, the largest market destination is the US. But we import a lot from China. So the first source of import for the ICT products, we import it from China. So you can imagine if the decoupling happens, then it will be difficult for Indonesia, right? Because we import a lot from China, then we export to the US. Definitely, Indonesia's ICT export products contain some of the inputs from China. So this is the second point. And the third point is Indonesia also sees the US as a source of investment as well. US invests a lot through like its multinational tech companies, Meta, among other, Google, Amazon Web Services, and so on and so forth. They built submarine cable connection to the US. They opened data centers in Indonesia. They also provide trainings to the Indonesians and so on and so forth. So source of investment. And the last one is, I think the US is also a custodian of democracy. Indonesia is a democratic country, and we really appreciate when the US talks about democracy and civil society engagement and so on and so forth. But in this case, I think Ilaria already mentioned in the beginning, there are differences in the way US and China tech companies engage with the local stakeholders. The US tech companies, really well engaged with the non-governmental organization in Indonesia. And that's why I think we are well informed and we also contribute to the decision-making level. I think I remember there is one American company helped a lot the Indonesian government in creating AI ethics, a circulation letter. Otherwise, Indonesia will not have that kind of AI ethic guidance. So this kind of, great power competition helps Indonesia to develop and to also match with Indonesian development priorities. But I don't think like Indonesia and other ASEAN countries like afford if like the competition turns into unhealthy decoupling and so on and so forth. So let me stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Habib. And it's also notable that while there's many differences between the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, one thing that unites them is that they're all democracies. Yes. Ilaria, do you have anything to add?
Perhaps since we're still at the sort of rather general level, just two things that you made me think of. The first is, in a way, the short term, and then there's long-term implications of this. So the trade war, yes, now it's been protracted for several years, but I don't believe it's going to be a constant feature of China-US competition. So then, on the one hand, is the issue of how do Southeast Asian countries, and particularly these three, navigate the kind of short-term challenges of tariffs, of having to choose between one provider or the other in terms of specific critical technologies, right? And then there's a long-term issue in terms of the broader geopolitical competition, which, as Chantry mentioned, involves other aspects, obviously, security, economic, and so on and so forth. And that is, I believe, will be a constant feature of a US-China relationship. Now, the question is, how do we manage that? So it might not always be at its peak, but there will be elements of definitely competition, sometimes the perception of security threats on either side. So how is Southeast Asia going to manage that at the national level and also at the kind of ASEAN level? And then perhaps one sort of sub-related point to this is the issue that you brought up, Habib, of price. Because, of course, Chinese technologies will continue to remain much cheaper than the alternative. And so then, in the long term, is it going to be possible for Southeast Asian countries to, in a way, maintain this distinction between economy or economic concerns on the one hand and security concerns on the other hand? Now, there's geopolitics has been resurgent in literature and also in media and policy talks, but also the concept of geoeconomics. So how is it going to be sustainable for Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines to sustain this distinction? And I know for sure that, for instance, in the Philippines, and what I remember from our conversations with experts there is that because of the South China Sea issue, there is much more separation there, at least in certain sectors. So, when we talk to people in the military or from the armed forces, they draw a very, they draw the line when it comes to acquiring Chinese technologies. But in other sectors, that was not the case. So yeah, I wonder, and sorry for throwing more questions at you really, rather than providing an answer or a comment, but I wonder, about this relationship between the kind of solving or navigating the short versus longer term implications of this. But we can get back to these issues as we discuss, I guess. Okay. I just wanted to.
Good. So let's.
Sorry about that.
Absolutely fine. But I'd like to move the discussion on to looking at sort of concrete examples of where choices need to be made. In Southeast Asia, a lot of attention has been given to 5G technology. Obviously, in Europe, the United States, attention to 5G technology is more about bizarre conspiracy theories. But in Southeast Asia, the concern about 5G technology has been the need to make a choice between providers, particularly from Europe or from China, and what are the ramifications of making that choice. So I can start with Cheng Chui. So we have Malaysian telecom company Umobile recently chose Huawei, ZTE, two Chinese technology firms as partners for a new 5G network. So can you give us a bit of insight into that? For example, what's the relationship between the Malaysian company and the Chinese technology partners? And is the Malaysian company, is the Malaysian government able to assert autonomy when dealing with much larger Chinese companies?
Thank you very much, Nick, for this difficult question. And let me try to address that difficult question with 3 points. And if it is not sufficient, I will probably entrap my colleague Fikri to also add anything that Fikri thinks will make it more accurate accurate reflection of a very complex issue. So 3 points. First point is that about Umobile. And for those of you who are not familiar with this issue, Umobile is a Malaysian firm that is chosen by the current Malaysian government, Anwar Ibrahim government, for the second 5G network. Yeah? And second means that you will ask who is the first, right? And who is the partner. So first was chosen by the then Muhyiddin government, and he chose Ericsson as the choice for the first and primary. Back then, a single network, and it was managed by a government entity called DNB. Yeah, so Umobile is chosen more recently. Last year, there have been a lot of talks, and Umobile is complex in the sense that we call it a local firm, but you also know that there is actually Singapore entity. Yeah. Earlier on, at the very beginning, was quite a big stake, and now reduced to a much lower. But it's also a local firm, not just private. There is a royal involvement, big stake, right? So there are a lot of sensitive and also a complex issue. But Umobile, certainly, it's a kind of a Malaysian player with complex background, as I mentioned, internally and also externally. So now the second point, how to make sense of this scenario in a way that address the next question. Second point is that about Huawei and ZTE, just like in Indonesia and Thailand, Philippines, and elsewhere, Chinese tech firm giants like Huawei, ZTE, they are not new players, right? They make a long-standing presence in different parts of Southeast Asia, hardware and many forms. 5G, they play a big role. So in a way, it is not just U-Mobile that has like kind of partnership with Huawei or ZTE, right? So I don't think it's kind of like specifically tailored for some interest. Another competitors of U-Mobile, Maxis, right? It's also partner with Huawei in one way or another. So there is a kind of like a long-standing regional, national complex across the board. And that brings me to the third point. The third point, it's to understand this very complex issue. I think what Giacomo's favorite, one of your favorite phrases, technological neutrality, will help us to understand again about host country agency, national government's complexity and also a dilemma. Malaysia provide a very interesting case for many reasons. One reason is that those of you familiar with Malaysia, you know that we got independence in 1957, right? So for 61 years, 1957 until 2018, no change of government. We are a democratic country, but no change of government. Ruling coalition has been very dominant, right? Things changed after 2018. 2018, finally, there was a change of government. And we joke about be careful with what you wish, right? And 5 years from 2018, 5 years, 5 governments. 5 years, 5 governments, a lot of things are changing or some are recalibrated, but neutrality is something that remain the same. Despite changing government, despite changing coalition, despite changing leaders who hate each other, but when necessary, they will hug each other as well for survival, right? So the point here is that technological neutrality is really the big context. They will understand U-Mobile, Huawei team up, and they will trace back, and that's my final point before I pass on back to Nick, is that Anwar Ibrahim came to power 2022. 2023, he made that statement that as Malaysia wants to benefit technologically from the West, meaning Ericsson and European and Western techs, we also want to benefit from the East. And by that, he was implying, right? Huawei, in one way or another, is going to play some role as well. So that set the stage in what we are seeing today. So it's not like a few weeks, few months. It's actually a few years kind of processes and also changing dynamics. But again, technological neutrality. It's the bottom line in the sense that we want to be as diversified as possible in one way or another. We know it's a multi-sector, multi-actor. Let's leverage on that very messy processes and leverage as much as possible. No guarantee, but it creates some space to maneuver in one way or another. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cheng Chui, and also for reminding us that Malaysia and Norway share a history of very long periods of government by the same party. So, Habib, if I can hand over to you. Indonesian telecoms company have had a long, fairly long history, going back about 5 years, of partnership with Huawei. And I was wondering, in 5G technology, I was wondering, what's the experience of that relationship, and how has the Indonesian government been able to govern, that technology partnership?
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for the question. So I think Chinese tech companies, when we look at the record, they have been operating in Indonesia ever since early 2000 or even late 1990s, when they try to open up and then they look at market abroad and so on and so forth. And then Indonesia, they think that as a neighbor and also as a huge market, Indonesia has 270 million people and also across 17,000 islands. And oh yeah, this is a good opportunity to to test the ground whether their products are being consumed and so on and so forth. And then over the years, these kind of partnership evolves, and they look at the different kind of technology. I guess in the past it's about smartphones, and then these days about 5G and also data centers, and especially about the green technology like EV, like electric vehicles and so on and so forth. So I think China has been seeing Indonesia for over the past 2 decades in that regard. But there are several characteristics why China sees Indonesia is a right match for their product, right? One is because the level of middle class in Indonesia is still not much. Definitely, our population need like affordable technological products, and that's why they sell like different technological companies come to Indonesia, Huawei, ZTE, and so on and so forth. And even when I talk about like 1990s and also like 2000, Huawei submarine cables have been building, submarines cables in Indonesia, connecting different islands and so on and so forth. So that's one because there is a need, there is a demand from the Indonesian side to be more connected across islands. I mean, Indonesia's income is not high yet as Malaysia or as Singapore or as Thailand do, but yeah, we want to reap all digital opportunities, right? Either digital economy, among others, and so on and so forth. And that's why I think the second point is Chinese companies, understand doing business in Indonesia. Sometimes it involves business under the table practices and so on and so forth. Or sometimes they also complement it with additional complementary packages like a workshop, training, capacity building, and so on and so forth. And for the Indonesian government, that puts the price factor as the main consideration for any kind of government procurement, then it definitely resonates for them. Doesn't impose any upfront conditionalities, but gives so much additional a bonus basically like for the technological users and so on and so forth. So basically this is the way. And with regards to the way China operates in Indonesia, they learn so much from both the US and also Japan. So learns from the US in terms of doing engagement with all stakeholders, either non-governmental organization like media, journalists, think tank, faith-based organizations in Indonesia. They do, approach them, and they also provide scholarship. They also send them like to China to better understand, context in China, digital governance, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. And the other one is, I think they learn from Japan in the way they create a network up to the last mile communities, right? So small and medium enterprises in Indonesia can make a direct purchase from China and at the affordable level. And they have set up like these kind of transport and logistical mechanisms. So a distributor. So Indonesian SMEs act as a distributor of Chinese companies in a way, and because they learn from Japan. And the other lesson they learn from Japan is picking key decision makers that enable these kind of cooperation or economic partnership continues. So that's why. I mean, like with regards to the 5G, just like my last point. I'm sorry, I speak too long. Just one last point about 5G. Actually, Indonesia, Indonesian Telecom, state-owned telecommunication company, cooperated with Huawei since 2017. We did a trial back then. But in 2019, interestingly, Indonesia state-owned telecommunication company, made two memorandum of understanding simultaneously with two big tech companies. I mean, I would like to quote Dr. Kwek and also Giacomo about technological neutrality. When 2019, Indonesia signed two MOUs, they signed it with one Chinese company and the other one with American company. So this is the way we try to balance, the perception that Indonesia is not really being dominated, despite the economic character that we have or the geographical character that we have. We still want to show the world that Indonesia adopts like the so-called free and active or non-aligned foreign policy. So yeah, let me stop.
It was all very interesting. So Julio, the Philippines obviously has a much more difficult relationship with China than Malaysia and Indonesia. Only in the last few days, there have been renewed clashes between ships, and the situation is extremely concerning. I was wondering how, from the perspective of the Philippines, do you see the costs and risks, but also the benefits of using Chinese technology and sort of critical infrastructure such as 5G?
Great question, Nick. And I apologize if I look at my notes all of the time because I wake up at Oslo at the time I take my siesta in Manila. I'm very confused right now.
As the moderator, I am wholly in favour of preparation. Don't worry.
So my brain is very confused at the time what I'm doing. But just to give context, the Philippines telecom sector has historically been dominated by two major homegrown firms, Globe Telecom and Smart Communications. Their entry into the 5G network, however, has been enabled through partnership with Chinese firms, most notably Huawei. And these collaborations have facilitated infrastructure development and technological upgrades essential to 5G development. During the Duterte administration, there emerged what was called the third player, Dito Telecommunity, and widely perceived as backed by Chinese capital and technology. Dito has benefited from upstream and downstream support originating from Chinese financial and technological networks. The trajectory of Philippines-China development cooperation presents a paradox, and of course, while international relations literature typically attributes such dynamics to a dual-track approach, namely the compartmentalization of bilateral issues and a broader hedging strategy towards great power competition, the Philippines is careful not to divorce its agency from its engagements with Beijing. Despite its long-standing alliance with the US, the Philippines has exercised strategic autonomy in selectively engaging with China in ways that prioritize national interests. The decision to deepen engagement with China is ultimately driven by domestic imperatives, particularly the need to secure infrastructure development, attract investment, and deliver on socio-economic objectives. In this light, cooperation with China reflects a pragmatic recalibration of our foreign policy in service of our national development goals. However, this engagement with China does not imply the abdication of strategic concerns. A central challenge of the compartmentalization approach is the recurrence of tensions in sensitive areas in the bilateral relationship, particularly in the maritime and territorial security domains. These disruptions tend to follow a cyclical pattern where economic cooperation is periodically offset by assertive behavior in contested areas. Such actions suggest that China may be leveraging economic engagement to exert political pressure, often without direct articulation. In the long term, the potential national security risks associated with Chinese technology are not lost on our Filipino policymakers. They are lost on many things, but sometimes national security, has a hold on them. Whether due to a lack of diplomatic finesse on China's part or a broader perception of technological dependence on China as a strategic liability, such concerns remain salient and foremost among their minds. The dual-use nature of Chinese infrastructure, serving both commercial and strategic functions, raise persistent apprehensions about the security implications of continued reliance on Chinese technology. Further, Chinese activities does not help its cause in this area because there are now emerging allegations of covert Chinese activities within Philippine territory. For instance, the proliferation of Philippine offshore gaming operators, while technically illegal in China, these gambling operations, most of the time, the operations in the Philippines are often staffed by Chinese nationals, which has been linked to various other problems such as labor trafficking and exploitative practices involving Southeast Asian migrants. Incidents involving Chinese nationals allegedly conducting unauthorized surveillance near our military bases, which are allowed to have the presence of US troops, have fueled fears of espionage targeting these military locations. Questions regarding Chinese entrenchment in domestic political structures have also surfaced, including a recent case in which a public official was found to have obtained Philippine citizenship through questionable means, despite being of purely Chinese descent. And during the Duterte administration, a Chinese company nearly secured a contract to install cellular infrastructure within the armed forces of the Philippines compound, raising alarms over the prospect of embedding foreign technology within sensitive military installations. So these are the tricky aspects of the relationship with the PRC, which often make it difficult for the Philippines to find ways to really work more proactively with China. But we are also seeing the dominance of Chinese hardware, their decisions, their plans, for example, to donate a lot of computers and devices to Philippine universities, to Philippine government agencies even, raises some alarms as to the extent that Huawei, for example, is really being entrenched in our infrastructure.
Yeah.
Thanks
Could I
very
add
much.
something, Nick?
Ilaria, yes.
I think you all underlined a very important thing, which I didn't say in the beginning, but of course, Chinese investments in technology and most generally in these three countries is not new. Neither is US's or Japan's investments, right? I mean, so for very good reasons, every research project has to be limited in its time frame. So the DSR starts in 2015, in fact, as the digital arm of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a 2013 initiative. But of course, these investments predate these initiatives. And Chinese private companies, and we can debate the whole day whether there is such a thing or not, but let's keep that for another discussion. But they have been, and this is very true, and not just in Southeast Asia, but also my previous research experience in Africa. They've been engaging with developing countries and building these long-term relationships for a long time. But also I wanted to point out that long gone are the days when, Huawei and Alibaba were just copycats of US companies. The incredible success of BYD, the EV Chinese company, which is far more successful than Tesla actually these days, I think is the case in point. Now we're going towards a point where Chinese tech companies are going to be much more successful, and at that point they will be probably better at making these products. They will make them cheaper. They would have learned because of decades of engagement with these countries. And so what I'm interested in is to see how this will impact then the future of the competition, because then you could argue, if anything, that Europe, which has tried, in fact, to engage with digital connectivity in Southeast Asia to maybe mixed results, are they ever going to be able to catch up with this because of exactly decades of entrenched relationships, not just between elites, right, but also between private companies and sort of the business sectors in the host countries and China.
Thanks very much, Ilaria. Good point. So I think we've got time for another round of questions, and I'd like to have time for also questions from the audience. So if I can encourage the three of you to try to give some fairly brief answers. I'd like to move on to policies that each of the three governments have enacted to try to protect, defend, enhance the sort of local businesses, local industries. So, for example, in Malaysia, there are specific policies designed to give preferential treatment to the ethnic Malay population to try to readdress sort of historic economic disparities. And I'm wondering whether there's been any tension between these domestic Malaysian policies and the interests of foreign technology firms trying to work in the Malaysian technology sector. So Cheng Chui, if you could briefly answer that question, if that's possible.
So sorry for that's a problem as academic, right? You have a few points that you thought you want to reflect the complexity of this issue. Right? Yeah. And I would say this is actually the most complex of all your questions so far. So it's kind of tough to address that. But let me try to kind of answer Nick's question by saying Malaysia is a multicultural country, and therefore there has always been like a tension or uneasy coexistence in almost all respects, political, economic, and social, and so on and so forth. And that's even within Malaysia, let alone when involved some foreign issues and all that. So nationalism, clearly it's one kind of aspect to understand. But in this sense, I think one important point to unpack is that there is a sense of nationalism when it comes to technology and many other things. But in this case, it's quite selective for Malaysian government to deal with these kind of interactions. And I would say some, for example, would highlight the issue of Bumiputra as one kind of unique socio-political and socio-economic peculiarity in Malaysians' life and also a way of doing things. But that's, I would say, manifest in some sectors, not all sectors. When it comes to government procurement, FTA negotiation with US, Malaysia FTA, Malaysia EU FTA, and negotiate and those issues, Bumiputra or government procurements are clearly one big issue. But when it comes to technology and all that, I think government's approach has been quite kind of selective, right? Yeah. It can be quite selective and also kind of play down some issue and being pragmatic on other issues. And in this sense, I would say that the government also tried to provide the kind of address some local sentiments, different identity groups, but in a way still try to look at the big picture of addressing what are the national needs for Malaysia as some country that want to move up the technological ladders. One good example would be semiconductor, right? Semiconductor, you could see that it's a very multi-sector, a multi-actor landscape in a sense that, and it's not new, right? 1970s, Malaysia has already started. You have the so-called seven samurai, seven big external partners who are playing a big role in helping Malaysia to develop the high-tech sector back then. So who are those actors, right? They are all foreign companies, right? It's mainly from US, Japan, Western countries, European European firms as well. So those are kind of a reality to remind that despite all these identity and domestic inter-ethnic groups issues, when it comes to key sectors, developmental issues, government has always been pragmatic, try to manage nationalism in some sense, but on the key approach, still, I would say, pragmatic and look at the big picture. We don't pay attention to whose model and all that. Any model or any models, plural, that will help Malaysia's actual needs, I think they will go for it. And that was reflected in 1970 Samurai when government want to develop the semiconductor sector in Penang and also in the current context, right? We already mentioned it's not just US and China. European countries, Japan, Korea sector would also help. And each of them will find their own local partners. And local partners are primarily Malays, I would say, because of Bumiputra policy. But there are also other non-Malay or non-Bumiputra actors. I hope there is not quick answer, but it's needed answers to address a very complex question.
Thanks very much, Chewy. That was pretty brief, so that's fine.
Concise.
Concise, yes. So, Habib, to take another example, Indonesia has data localization regulations, as we find in Europe as well, of course, requiring data to be stored within Indonesian territory. This obviously has implications for cloud computing, cloud services, which in theory could be anywhere. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the rationale behind those regulations. Are they based on security concerns? And has there been any change in these policies in recent years?
Thank you for the question, Nick. I think the main reason behind this trend or this regulation is definitely about the growing resurgence of nationalism, right? Not only like for technology, but also for critical minerals. So what happened is that, you require, or Indonesia requires, the big technological companies to open data centers in Indonesia as a requirement to operate in the country. It's not necessarily about a security concern. It's more about, post-colonialism sentiment. Yeah, you need to own everything, basically, at home. And that's why they require this data center to be built in the country. And not only about data center, I mentioned about the critical minerals. They also do the same. They have, whenever any mineral companies want to operate in Indonesia, they have to build smelters so the country can gain, added value. So this kind of a post-colonial mindset or approach to the economic globalization, I think it doesn't necessarily work because it also decreases your own competitiveness at certain point. So that's the question. That's the answer to your question. But I think I would like to pick up your question, Ilaria, about whether Europe is able to catch up, right? I think like this is a very important question to ask, like whether Europe is able to catch up in the technological competition in the country. And related to your point on data localization and regulation in Indonesia, I think Indonesia is pretty much looking at Europe whenever there is any digital regulation. For example, about GDPR, right? GDPR is a good model for all countries across the world, including in Indonesia. So when Indonesia wants to create these personal data protection regulation, they learn from Europe. So if we talk about whether Europe is able to compete, yes, but at what segment or which segment? It's definitely, I would say, about normative element, being a good superpower in this regulation, model somehow, and that's one of the capital that you have. And then the other one is, I think, Indonesia these days also talks about a world beyond great powers. We talk about middle power coordination, right? I think Pak Cheng Chui, Dr. Quick, and also Julio mentioned a bit about the role of Japan or South Korea, and that's what Indonesia has been doing recently, especially when it comes to the technological cooperation. We look at French, for example, for building our national data center, the government-owned. So we cooperate with French in terms of like the financing, the technology, and the capacity building. We also cooperate with the UK to provide like satellite, telecommunication satellite. We cooperate with South Korea also on other aspect, especially with regards to the mineral processing. So yeah, this is more and more Indonesia thinks, let's diversify the technological cooperation, not really relying on the great powers. And Europe, if Indonesia's economy continues to grow, if Indonesia's middle class population continues to grow, that will also benefit the Europe. And because middle class can have more choices, right? And they do not necessarily consider the price factor; they also consider the brand. They also consider the quality, and that's where the Europe and Indonesia or other Southeast Asian countries can be more compatible in the future. But really it is really dependent on the growth, the economic growth in the country, and also like the political, the sustenance of the doctrine of this non-alignment. So let me stop. Sorry.
Okay, thanks very much. And for Julio, the Philippines presidency published a draft executive order on data sovereignty, I think about 2 years ago, and there's been a lot of debate about that. I was wondering if there had been lobbying by foreign technology companies, for example, trying to influence the debate in the Philippines.
Yes, Nick. And I'll just start by, Habib mentioned the use of the GDPR. I ran a project for the EU before and that I think that was the time the rollout of the GDPR, and we couldn't understand a single thing about it.
Neither could we.
We were like, okay, let's just do something and then hope that nobody checks.
Same here.
In any case, the normative aspect of that, I think, also brings pressure on us. I think the EU's role in norms is quite important. And the most important example, really, I would say, was the transformation of Apple, right, to use Type-C devices, bringing Apple users to the more civilized nature of Android systems.
He's been teasing me for like the whole time since he got here about Android systems being better than iPhone, but I still don't buy it. Sorry.
But yes, with regard to the EU, just as a short background, that the drafting of the EU and the executive order itself is very important, because in the case of the Philippines, a presidential directive such as an executive order carries the force of law until such time as Congress adopts legislation saying otherwise, or basically establishing what the executive order contains, and that the proposed EO outlines comprehensive measures concerning data localization. And there were some responses and criticisms on its potential economic and regulatory complications. Critics argue that the correlation between large-scale data flows and economic growth is undermined by the executive order's data localization mandate, and that the infrastructure required to store data domestically, including server maintenance and operational costs, could substantially increase the cost of digital services, particularly those involving foreign data. Stakeholders have expressed concern that the executive order may hinder the country's digital economic trajectory. Specifically, it could adversely impact key sectors such as the tech startup ecosystem, banking and financial services, and the information technology business process management industry, all of which rely on seamless cross-border data flows. And the executive order's stipulations may contradict the Philippines' obligations under regional and multilateral agreements that promote cross-border data flows, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and various ASEAN frameworks. These commitments are fundamentally designed to minimize barriers to data movements across borders. A formal letter addressed to the Philippine government by the Global Data Alliance, which is a coalition of multinational companies advocating for cross-border data flow, summarizes the core objection to the EO. According to the letter, the breadth and intensity of opposition from the international and domestic stakeholders we have basically contributed to the delay in finalizing the EO. Without comprehensive and transparent engagement in these concerns, sustained resistance is likely to persist. Our Department of Information and Communication Technology has formally stated that concerns surrounding the EO are largely unfounded. However, the rationale behind this position has not been sufficiently substantiated in the public discourse, and further clarification is needed to allay stakeholder apprehensions.
Thanks very much, Julio. So I'd like to move on to invite the audience to ask questions. I've just seen one there already. If we take a round of 3 questions to start with, and we've got a microphone coming around there, I would ask everyone to identify themselves when they're asking a question for the benefit of the rest of the audience.
Thank you very much. I'm Martin Nilsson. I'm a senior researcher here at PRIO. So thank you very much to the main speaker for your insights. Very, very interesting. And to the NORM project for bringing these capacities to Norway. Johan Galtung, which is the founder of PRIO, he spent about his last decades predicting the fall of the US within a year. I think if he was still alive, he would probably stick with his predictions. I'm not going to follow in that tradition, but I think you, Ilaria, you touched a little bit on it, Habib as well. If we're saying that perhaps the US is not imploding in the next minute, but that there might be a paradigm shift in the world order. And I think this goes beyond Donald Trump. It's something about the world order that the US created. It's not seen as benefiting them to the same extent as before, and Trump is perhaps a symptom of this. I think it was very interesting how you talk about ASEAN, or maybe ASEAN countries, as benefiting from this mixed privilege of being kind of neutral. And that this is an important part of the national strategies as well. Say if there is a big paradigm shift, what would that look like in this kind of neutrality policy of ASEAN countries? Habib, you mentioned about looking to other Asian countries, also European countries as a mediating strategy or whatever. But what about ASEAN as an institution? Julio has talked about it as mainly national interest around the table. But is there any strategies, any development of better integrating Southeast Asian or ASEAN policies within the ASEAN?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marta. I saw the gentleman at the back there. I saw him.
Thank you very much. My name is Anantha Krishnan from Urban Economy Forum. I'm just interested in one aspect that you just briefly touched, the question of citizens' influence and control of technology. We have been talking about it Very often what we see is that technological companies produce things and become consumers. So what extent, we can see democratization. We talk about digital, what shall I say, sort of digital control or control of digitalization means. Does digitalization control us, or can we control digitalization? To what extent, the democracy is not about governments and companies. To what extent, the civil society, public, have a possibility to see what kind of technology they want and how they want to use it. Are there good examples in this context? I'd like to know. Then one more point is that historically, in the post-colonial sense, most of the Southeast Asian countries have been having a sort of an anti-Chinese posture. That. Malaysia is an example. Sukarno's, Suharto's 35 years of government. So it's a continuation of a pro-West, pro-US thing. So this fear of Chinese technology is not something new. It is the continuation of the old fear of the great, the Red China, isn't it? Thanks.
Thanks very much. And last I saw the gentleman there. If we can take that question. If you can keep it brief, that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much. So this is Imran. I work at the University of Oslo, and I come from Bangladesh, which is also situated like this Southeast Asian countries in terms of technological alliance and other great powers and their rivalry in that. So my question is that in terms of Bangladesh, what I have seen and what about other Southeast Asian countries? I personally perceive that there are long-serving political parties, and so it has been clear that these political parties or these states actually prioritizing national interest over regime interest. So it is a bit odd to me. What I have seen in Bangladesh is that political parties welcoming Starlink as a part of bidding the mind of Donald Trump. And while the previous regime just aligned with Chinese digital infrastructure and the service providing companies so that it can also do a bit of more surveillance. Because these countries have electoral democracy, but they lack sort of accountability to the people. So why these East Asian countries compared to another East Asian country vis-a-vis, for example, Bangladesh, is failing in sort of prioritizing national interest over regime interest? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I can hand over, I think we can start with Julio for responses. We've got about 15 minutes and I want to give the last word to Ilaria. So again, please be mindful of time. Sorry, Habib, sorry. I said the wrong word. Sorry.
Oh yeah, thank you for all the questions. I think like all of them are great and also very difficult to answer. Especially the question for you, from you, Martha, about the big paradigm shift and how Indonesia sees ASEAN, right? So I don't know whether you realize or not, in this current regime, I think there is a tendency from Indonesia to do adventure. We joined BRICS as its latest member, right? We also attend like G20 summit in Latin American countries and also APEC and so on and so forth. Though like the platforms are existing like for a while, but Indonesia's president traveling to Latin American countries are very rare in this past decades. So that's why I think we also want to show the world that we are open to all opportunities, not only in the region, but also abroad. And the question about ASEAN, whether we will see, more ASEAN integration in the future because of this big paradigm shift or not, I think from the Indonesian perspective, I am quite pessimistic. I think I shared with the colleagues yesterday, there are several elements or answers why Indonesia is, a bit pessimistic about this ASEAN integration because one, economic complementarity doesn't exist yet. We compete to each other on several sectors. And second is about, no threat perception. I think no single threat perception. Krishna mentioned about anti-communism back in the past, but these days it's difficult to measure the level of we deal with China or like the way we deal with non-traditional security issues and so on and so forth. The third one is ASEAN is very much bureaucratic these days. Adding more layers like to the domestic bureaucracy, and then the fourth one is no electoral incentives. Indonesians like other people around the world, I think, are not well exposed to foreign policy. And that's why, I mean, like, let alone ASEAN, they do not think about ASEAN on a daily basis and so on and so forth. That doesn't give Indonesia incentive, right, to pursue more better integration. But I think I hear Dr. Quick optimism about like this ASEAN integration. At the normative level and at the coordination mechanism, I think we still put ASEAN as an indispensable mechanism for this foreign policy issue. So that's I hope I answered your question. And Krishna, to you about historical Southeast Asia and about the continuation of this anti-China. I think, these days we in Indonesia, we do not necessarily talk about the China threat anymore openly. But in a private conversation, yes, this perception remains because sometimes it's about the economic reasons, right? The economic dominance, economic powerhouse. Yes, Indonesia and China cooperate, but many people also realize that there are risks to this kind of, economic cooperation. For example, the trade diversion that China may do because of this U.S. tariff war, right, to Southeast Asian countries, flooding and also probably, killing hitting the small and medium enterprises or closing down the factories and so on and so forth. Or if Chinese investment comes with low-skilled laborers, then they will compete with Indonesian who mostly work in the informal sector. Like 60% of Indonesian population work in the informal sectors. So there is this kind of conversation happening, but in a private manner. So yeah, there is a continuation of this kind of anti-colonialism sentiment. I let my other colleagues to answer the last question, but yeah.
Okay, so Julio.
Thank you. Very different questions, but at the same time, let me just also reinforce what Habib said. The nature of regional decision making is quite difficult in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, precisely because ASEAN has remained to be an intergovernmental body. Unlike in the EU, where you have a supranational government that can make decisions on behalf of member states, in ASEAN, national interests remain paramount. So for us, when we talk about China, we talk about the US, our first reaction would be when the US imposed tariffs is what should we do as a country first? We didn't ask what we should do as an ASEAN first, as a region first, because our foreign policy and other national decision-making policies are not mediated through ASEAN. And while we remain optimistic that ASEAN could, become an important body for us in Southeast Asia, this should be understood in the fact that hope is one of important foreign policy that exists in Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines. Now, going back to the question of whether it's consumers that should decide technology or whether it's the states, what we found out in the Philippines through this research is that the answer is better some than none. That is, we'd rather choose, Huawei for their phones and for their other equipment rather than not having any at all. But that, of course, does not mean that decisions are purely democratic because there are national security concerns, except that in a country like the Philippines, like, for example, we have had so many data hacks that we know that data privacy is not an issue anymore. At some point, all of our data is out there. So why be concerned about, having Beijing direct access to our data? If we could have a cell phone that is as good as an iPhone or a Samsung, but as, cheap, half as cheap, why not? So this seems to be a common sentiment. But at the same time, again, what I mentioned earlier is that these have to be mediated by our national security concerns, that, it is also difficult to be fully entrenched in the part of the system of a country that seems to like to actively seek, to get into your systems, such as what is China doing. And then the question of Bangladesh, unfortunately right now, when it comes to technology, there is no regime survival issue at stake for us. So it's really a choice between what is available, what is cheap, what is complicated, and what is not to get. So it is not a question of survival for us. It is more of addition. We would want Starlink to be more present as well, because of the fact that our current broadband situation is actually just bad. So more is better in that sense. So the way I would summarize it is that our relationship with these great powers is also confounded by the fact that these great powers also blunder in the way that they approach us. With the PRC, for example, one issue that was apparent is that Filipino Chinese nationals are more Filipino than Chinese in that sense. But the way that the Chinese government comes to say that they are representing these individuals are not accepted at all because they then interfere in domestic issues while coming into the form of trying to be a protector of a community that does not regard them as their own government. Now, with the U.S., on the other hand, yes, we do favor more, but the problem with U.S. investments is, or not their problem, but when they encounter or they come to the Philippines, they find that ease of doing business is not really easy, right? And that there are many layers before you can get the business started, and that, of course, complicates investment from other countries. So, which player understands better the domestic nature, the best domestic rules and regulations, actually have more advantage when it comes to Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Julio. And Cheng Chui?
All right. In the time that I have, let me address Martha's question. And I think there are three aspects that you highlighted. One is about paradigm shift, ASEAN, and then neutrality. So let me address in that order. First, about paradigm shift, I would say that from how we see from Southeast Asia, and I would say much of a global South, the paradigm shift, the geopolitical shift and power shift already ongoing, even well before Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. Trump 2.0 is accelerating in scale, in scope, and speed, right? So that's number one. Second, about ASEAN, I would like to say that in various occasions, I describe ASEAN as a regional grouping. It's a three-eye regional grouping. Three-eye in what sense? It's imperfect, it's insufficient, but always indispensable, as Habib highlighted, right? So what do you mean by insufficient but indispensable? Means that ASEAN, just like any other regional grouping or any foreign policy tool, cannot solve all problems. There is no such thing, not even EU, right? Certainly not United Nations. But without ASEAN, we are going to have bigger problems and a longer list of problems in so many ways. I won't have time to elaborate, but one good example to quote my old and good friend Julio, he mentioned about RCEP, right? I thought that is a good example to show that without ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, there would not be any hope to have RCEP. RCEP meaning a regional comprehensive economic partnership that includes all 10 ASEAN countries plus the three Northeast Asia economic powerhouses of China, Japan, and also South Korea, plus Australia and also New Zealand. And that is the biggest economic arrangement on earth in our time so far, right? Without ASEAN, impossible. Because Northeast Asia countries, for economic logic, should have and could have come with their own economic arrangement. But for political logic, impossible. Through ASEAN, small state-led organization, it becomes possible. But as I said, it's insufficient, right? Insufficient but indispensable. That leads me to the third and also final point on neutrality. Neutrality, I know it become a sensitive word, especially in Europe after a Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? But in Southeast Asia, we still stick to neutrality. In fact, earlier on, Ilaria mentioned about hedging, right? In many contexts, I wanted to explain what we mean by hedging. And I like to say that hedging means neutrality plus. Neutrality plus in the sense that you insist that you don't want to take sides, but you know that the passive and reactive neutrality is not enough. You are going to face problems, especially with Trump 2.0 intensifying US-China rivalry. But what active in neutrality plus in what way? In active, inclusive, and adaptive way. And that's what I think almost all countries in Southeast Asia and beyond are doing, right? Philippines has its own peculiar dynamics, but active in what way? We are underscoring and doing a lot of things that we want to make sure that our neutrality position does not change. Inclusive in the sense that I think we already mentioned in technology and non-technological sense, we are collaborating with the Western powers, quote unquote, both for US and also Western and other countries, and Europe and other countries. But we also try to engage Japan, South Korea, China as much as possible, right? Inclusive. Adapting in the sense that as things become more uncertain, you adapt by doing more rather than less, right? So you keep adding layers. Relate to my earlier point is that today the survival require us to do not just about ASEAN and ASEAN-wide or ASEAN-based. We are doing a lot of ASEAN plus and ASEAN plus plus. One, any good example, during this year as Malaysia as the chair of ASEAN, one of the new mechanisms being put forward, in fact, it will happening next week, coincidentally, it's ASEAN GCC China. So you are going to see, you are seeing that ASEAN as a grouping, we know it's insufficient, but you do as much as possible to bridge Southeast Asia with now GCC and other regions, and together with China, and I'm pretty sure it will not stop at ASEAN, GCC, China. I'm pretty confident as things become more uncertain, it will become ASEAN, GCC plus, whether +3, +6, or +8 or more, and whether EU will be part of this remain to be seen. But my sense is that it's going to happen. Final point to say that, again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that all these mechanisms plus based on who will be sufficient. You know it's insufficient and it's beyond our control. And hedging or neutrality plus is not just about getting benefits. Yeah. It's actually more about, hedging is more about mitigating risks that are beyond anyone's control. You do as much as possible and whatever is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Cheng Chui, Habib, and Julio. I commend you for your self-discipline and keeping us on time. And the last word to Ilaria.
I need to comment on Marta's question because, as you know, this is at the heart of my work. You already said that, right? There's obviously a shift ongoing, multiple shifts, in fact, and I don't know where it is going. But I want to believe that democracy in its many shapes and forms is resilient enough to sustain these shifts. But evidently, we are going into a world of, many have called it disorder, uncertainty, fragmentation, transactional relations, and as much ideology being out the window, perhaps. But so as much as a world of deep ideological conflict was hard to manage, I think that also a world without, deep ideological conflict is equally hard to manage, and it comes with its own challenges that we somewhat need to deal with. But that's so final word for me. I wanted to conclude the event and really the project with a round of thank yous. So first and foremost to the audience for both online and in person for taking the time to join us today. To the whole research team, again, 12 people. And also I wanted to say Fikri from Malaysia and Derek from the Philippines are sitting with us. To you guys, because it's not every day that you get to flying these brilliant minds from so far away. And it's been extremely fun and rewarding working with you. And I hope that, again, as I said yesterday, we can continue doing so in the future. A huge thank you to Yoshiharu, our amazing research assistant, because not only he has made incredible contributions to the project since he joined PRIO last year, but he's also made sure that everything has been running smoothly. So thank you, Yoshi. And last but not least, thank you to the Research Council of Norway for funding this project and believing us when we strongly argued in our application that this was a very urgent and interesting project that needed money. And I think that today we proved to be exactly that. So thank you again, everyone.